Something just shifted in Washington, and it's happening faster than most people realize. In the last few developments, pressure has started building at the same time around both Joe Biden and Donald Trump, not from one direction, but from multiple systems moving together. And when that happens, it usually means one thing. The situation is no longer isolated. It's becoming systemic. But here's the part that makes this different from a normal political cycle. This is not just about elections or messaging or even legal questions on their own. This is about what happens when legal pressure, political strategy, and institutional response all begin to overlap at the same time. Because once that overlap begins, things don't move in straight lines anymore. They accelerate, they react to each other, and sometimes they escalate faster than anyone expects. But that's just the surface, because underneath everything you're seeing right now, there's a deeper shift happening, one that could affect not just the next election, but how the system operates long after that. Stay with me, because once you see how these pieces connect, the bigger picture becomes impossible to ignore. Right now, there are 3 separate tracks unfolding at the same time, and each one, on its own, would already be significant. But together, they create something much bigger. First, the legal track. Inside the Department of Justice, reviews tied to past decisions and actions are still ongoing. These are not sudden developments. They've been building quietly over time. But now the timing has changed, because what once existed in the background is now happening during a critical political window, and that changes how every move is interpreted. Second, the congressional track. Committees are increasing oversight, requests for documents are expanding, hearings are being prepared and positioned for visibility. And even when no immediate decision comes out of those hearings, the process itself creates pressure, because it brings attention, it creates narratives, and it signals that something is actively being examined. Third, the political track. Campaign messaging is shifting, not randomly, not emotionally, but strategically. Words are being chosen more carefully, topics are being emphasized or avoided. And when messaging changes like this, it usually means internal calculations are also changing. Now here's where it becomes more complex. These 3 tracks are no longer separate. They are starting to interact. Legal developments influence political messaging influences public reaction increases pressure on institutions, and institutions respond, which then feeds back into the legal process. That cycle, once it begins, creates momentum, and momentum in situations like this is very difficult to slow down. But to really understand what's happening, you have to step back further, because none of this started today. Over the past several years, there has been a steady buildup of tension between political leadership and federal institutions. Investigations, responses, public statements, counter-statements, each event adding another layer. At first, those layers were spaced apart. One event would happen, then fade, then another would begin. But now those layers are overlapping, and that overlap is what changes the situation completely. Because when issues don't resolve before new ones begin, the system doesn't reset. It carries forward tension. And over time, that tension builds until eventually it starts affecting how decisions are made in real time. That's the stage we're entering now. So who actually feels the impact of this? It's not just the individuals involved, it extends much further. Start with political leadership. Current and future leaders are now operating in an environment where decisions don't stay in the past. They remain active, they remain relevant, and sometimes they return years later under completely different circumstances. That changes behavior, because when decisions have long-term consequences, leaders begin to think differently about how they act and how those actions are recorded. Next, federal institutions. Agencies like the Department of Justice are no longer just decision makers, they are also under continuous observation. Every move is analyzed, not just for its legal basis, but for its perceived intent. And perception in this environment carries enormous weight, because once perception begins to shape narrative, narrative begins to shape reality. Then, the public. Because trust in institutions is not built during stable periods, it is tested during uncertain ones. When multiple narratives emerge, people don't just observe outcomes, they interpret patterns, they look for consistency, and they form conclusions based on what they see repeated over time. And that's why this moment matters beyond a single headline, because what's happening now is already starting to reshape how the system functions. We are seeing early signs of three major shifts. First, the boundary between politics and law is becoming less clear. Actions that were once viewed as purely political are now being evaluated through legal frameworks much more quickly. Second, institutional neutrality is being questioned more openly, not occasionally, but consistently, and that constant evaluation changes how institutions operate. Third, election cycles are no longer separate from ongoing investigations or legal discussions. They overlap, and that overlap creates a more complex environment for everyone involved. And here's the key factor that ties all of this together: timing. Because all of these developments are happening as the next election cycle begins to accelerate. Campaigns are preparing, strategies are being finalized, public attention is increasing, which means any development right now carries more impact than it normally would. So what happens next? That's where things become uncertain, because there isn't just one possible outcome. There are several, and they can overlap. One path: escalation. Legal processes move forward more aggressively, and visible actions begin to take shape. Another path: controlled pacing. Actions continue, but at a lower visibility level, reducing immediate impact. A third path: political dominance. Messaging, narratives, and public positioning begin to shape the situation more than legal developments themselves. And right now, the system appears to be balancing between these paths, but that balance is not stable. It can shift quickly. So what should be watched carefully from here? Official communication from the Department of Justice, changes in congressional activity, and subtle shifts in political messaging, because those signals often appear before major developments. And one final point to understand clearly: this is not just about individuals. It's about how a system responds when multiple pressures are active at once. And once patterns begin to form in moments like this, they don't disappear. They carry forward. They shape future decisions, and they redefine expectations over time. So the real question is not just what happens next, it's how these changes continue to evolve, how they influence the next election, and how the system adapts to a reality where pressure is no longer isolated, but connected. Now, here's where the situation starts to move from complex to critical. Because once multiple systems begin reacting at the same time, the question is no longer just what is happening. The real question becomes who reacts first and how. And that matters more than it seems, because in Washington, reactions often shape outcomes just as much as the original events themselves. Right now, there are early signals of defensive behavior across multiple levels. Not dramatic, not public in most cases, but visible if you look closely. Internal communication is becoming more controlled. Public statements are becoming more precise, and timelines are being watched more carefully than before. This kind of shift usually indicates one thing: people inside the system understand that the environment has changed, and when that realization spreads, behavior changes with it. Take political messaging, for example. What used to be direct is now more measured. What used to be reactive is now more calculated. Because when multiple processes are active at once, every statement carries more weight, not just politically, but legally and strategically. And that leads to something important. Silence starts to matter just as much as speech, because what is not being said often reveals as much as what is being said. Now look at institutions. When pressure increases, institutions tend to respond in one of two ways. They either move faster to resolve uncertainty, or they slow down to avoid making high-impact decisions under pressure. And right now, we're seeing signs of both. Some areas appear to be moving forward, while others are becoming more cautious. That split response is important because it creates uneven momentum, and uneven momentum often leads to sudden shifts when one side moves faster than expected. Now, here's where things become even more interesting, because this situation is not only being shaped internally, it's also being shaped externally by perception. Media coverage, public discussion, political framing, all of these influence how events are understood in real time. And once a narrative begins to form, it can accelerate the situation further, because perception doesn't wait for full information. It forms early and then adjusts later. And that creates a gap between what is known and what is believed. In stable situations, that gap is small, but in moments like this, it can grow quickly. And when that gap grows, pressure increases on institutions, on leadership, and on the system as a whole. Now, consider timing again, because timing is not just about when things happen, it's about when things are revealed. A development that might have had limited impact months ago could now carry much greater weight simply because of when it appears. And that's why timing decisions become strategic, not just operational. So at this stage, every move is being evaluated across 3 dimensions: legal impact, political consequence, public reaction. And balancing those 3 is not simple, because improving one often affects the others. For example, moving quickly on a legal decision might create clarity, but it could also increase political tension. Slowing down might reduce immediate pressure, but it could increase long-term uncertainty. And that's the position the system is in right now, balancing speed, visibility, and impact all at once. Now, here's something even more important to understand. This situation is creating new behavioral patterns. Inside political leadership, caution is increasing. Inside institutions, documentation and process awareness are increasing. And across the system, there is a growing focus on traceability, meaning actions are not just being taken, they are being recorded, structured, and preserved more carefully. Because in an environment like this, the ability to show what happened and when becomes critical. And once that kind of behavior becomes standard, it doesn't go away. It becomes part of how the system operates. Now, let's look at the broader impact, because this doesn't stay contained within Washington. Federal agencies across different departments begin adjusting their own processes. State-level institutions start watching closely, and even private organizations begin responding to the uncertainty. Why? Because when central systems experience pressure, that pressure spreads outward, and that spread can affect timelines, decisions, and expectations far beyond the original issue. Now, here's where the situation starts to move toward a turning point. Not a single event, but a phase. A phase where decisions begin to shift from preparation to execution. Up to now, much of what has been happening is positioning, reviewing, preparing, calculating. But at some point, that phase ends, and actions begin. The challenge is that that transition is rarely announced. It becomes visible after it starts. So the key question becomes, how will we know when that shift happens? There are a few signals: sudden increases in official communication, clear alignment between institutions, and more direct, less cautious public statements. When those signals appear together, it usually means the system has moved into action mode. And when that happens, timelines compress, events move faster, and reactions become more immediate. Now, connect that back to where we are right now. We are still in the late preparation phase, but movement is increasing, signals are becoming more clear, and the distance between preparation and action is getting smaller, which means the next phase could begin sooner than expected. And once it begins, the entire pace of the situation changes. So again, what should be watched most closely? Not just what happens, but how quickly it happens. Because speed, in moments like this, often reveals the level of urgency inside the system, and urgency reveals priority, and priority tells you what matters most to those making decisions. So as this continues to develop, the key is not just to follow events, it's to watch patterns, watch timing, watch reactions. Because in a situation like this, the pattern tells the story before the headlines do. And the pattern right now is still forming, but it's moving. And once it fully takes shape, the direction of what comes next will become much clearer. Now, here's where everything begins to come together. Up to this point, we've been looking at movement, signals, and patterns forming inside the system. But when those patterns start aligning, that's when direction becomes visible. And right now, we're approaching that moment. Because the system cannot stay in a preparation phase forever. At some point, decisions move forward, and when they do, the effects are not isolated. They ripple outward quickly. So the real focus now is not just what is happening, but where it is leading. There are 3 clear directions this situation can take from here, and each one carries very different consequences. The first direction, full escalation. This is where legal processes move forward in a visible, decisive way. Actions become public, timelines tighten, and responses follow immediately. If that path begins, the impact is immediate. Media coverage intensifies, political messaging becomes more aggressive, and institutions move into a faster operational mode. But escalation doesn't just increase speed, it also increases pressure. Because once actions are visible, they create reactions that cannot be reversed. The second direction, controlled containment. In this path, movement continues, but visibility is limited. Processes stay active, but outcomes are delayed. This approach reduces immediate disruption, but it comes with a trade-off. Uncertainty remains in the system longer, and prolonged uncertainty can create its own form of instability. The third direction, narrative dominance. In this scenario, political messaging and public perception begin to shape reality more than formal actions. Statements, framing, and interpretation take the lead, and the situation becomes less about what is happening and more about how it is understood. This path is less predictable because perception can shift quickly and in multiple directions at once. Now, here's the critical point. These 3 directions are not completely separate. They can overlap, they can interact, and they can transition from one to another faster than expected. Which means the system is not choosing one path, it is balancing between them. And that balance is what determines what happens next. So, how do you recognize which direction is taking hold? If escalation is beginning, you will see rapid, coordinated movement across multiple institutions, not isolated actions, but aligned ones. If containment is the priority, you will see fewer public updates and longer gaps between developments, but internal activity will continue. If narrative dominance takes over, you will see a surge in messaging, analysis, and competing interpretations, often without immediate new facts. And right now, all 3 signals are present in early form. That's what makes this moment different, because the system is not stable, but it hasn't fully shifted either. It is in transition, and transition phases are where the most significant changes begin. Because once the direction becomes clear, the pace increases, decisions accelerate, and outcomes move closer. Now, step back for a moment, because what's happening here is not just about timing or strategy or even outcome. It's about transformation. The way decisions are made, the way institutions respond, the way political processes interact with legal frameworks, all of it is evolving. And once those changes take hold, they don't reset easily. They become the new baseline. Future decisions will be made differently. Future campaigns will operate differently, and future expectations will be shaped by what happens now. That's why this moment matters beyond immediate headlines, because it is setting patterns that will influence behavior long after this situation is resolved. So the focus shouldn't just be on the next update. It should be on the direction of change, because direction determines impact, and impact determines what comes next, not just now, but in future cycles. Now, bring it back to where we started. A shift in Washington, multiple systems moving at the same time, legal, political, institutional, all interacting. At first, it looks like complexity, but when you break it down, it becomes something clearer. A system under pressure adapting in real time. And that adaptation is still in progress. So the real question isn't just what happens next, it's how far this goes, how much it reshapes the way decisions are made, how much it influences the next election cycle, and how the system adjusts once all of this settles. Because when pressure changes a system, the effects don't disappear when the pressure fades. They remain in structure, in behavior, and in expectation. And that means what we're seeing right now is not just a moment, it's a transition that is still unfolding. And as it continues, the direction will become clearer, the pace will increase, and the impact will become harder to ignore. So watch the signals, watch the timing, watch the patterns. Because once those patterns lock in, what comes next won't be a surprise. It will be the result of everything building right now. And that's where this story truly begins to matter.